Okay, so one quick thing. I did make a couple small little changes to the slides since last time. For instance, on this slide right here, I didn't name this task. We talked about this slide last time, which is pretty important. And you might notice that this is a task that McGilchrist does talk about also in Master and His Emissary, and it's talked about in the textbook as well. This is the Navon task, also known as the hierarchical letters task. So the Navon hierarchical letters task is what this thing is right here. It's talked about here in lecture. It was talked about in the textbook, though the textbook did focus on a slightly different variation of this study using lesion patients instead of what this was right here, which was intact normal patients, just using the hemifield presentation where the left visual field goes to the right hemisphere and the right visual field goes to the left hemisphere. And it's also talked about in the Master and His Emissary. So kind of all three sources of information in this course talk about this. So this is definitely an example of something that you could write your paper topic on. But I didn't mention last time, or I didn't write it in the slide. I probably said it verbally, but this is the Navon task, also known as the Navon hierarchical letters task. This is where we left off. Here's another thing which is copied by, which is talked about in both the textbook and in the Master and His Emissary. But I was just reviewing. I was just kind of rereading through the chapter that you guys have due for Thursday, and self-perception is definitely one of these areas where McGilchrist and Gazanniga seem to have different views regarding hemispheric asymmetry, whereas Gazanniga here in this data, and I talked about it last time, says that self-recognition relies more on the left hemisphere than the right. McGilchrist definitely says something different in the textbook. McGilchrist writes a lot about this idea of self versus other perception in the readings for Thursday. And it's definitely, so this is another potential area of topic ideas because both authors talk about hemispheric differences in self-perception, perception of oneself, but they pretty clearly differ in which hemisphere they think is the more important hemisphere for self-perception. There's some nuance there that that McGilchrist in particular picks up on that Gazanniga doesn't really pick up on. So continuing on, I guess I'll just review briefly. We talked about last time, McGilchrist talks about how prosopagnosia occurs primarily after right hemisphere lesions, which is true. That's supported by the evidence presented here. Remember, prosopagnosia is basically face blindness, a condition where you're not unable to recognize faces. In this study, there were 25 total patients who had unilateral lesions, meaning a lesion on one hemisphere or the other. And out of those 25 patients, 21 of them, the unilateral lesion was on the right side. Only 4 was the unilateral lesion on the left side. So what this shows is that about, 80% or so of people that have prosopagnosia with a unilateral lesion are going to have that lesion on the right hemisphere of the brain, which does support McGilchrist's claim that prosopagnosia is caused primarily by right hemisphere brain damage, though I might also mention the analogy that the brain is kind of like an airplane with 2 engines, and if one engine goes out, for a lot of people, the other engine can kind of take up the slack. So really, the thing which is most likely to cause prosopagnosia is bilateral damage, far and away, which, bilateral damage means there's a part in the right hemisphere which is damaged and a part in the left hemisphere which is damaged. That is by far the most likely thing to cause prosopagnosia. But with a unilateral lesion, one lesion on either the left or one lesion on either the right, right hemisphere lesion is more likely to lead to prosopagnosia than just a left hemisphere lesion. But of course, bilateral lesions, which include both right and left hemisphere lesions, are most likely to cause face blindness. I think that was a review. I think that's where I left off last time. So here is yet another topic with which both Gazanniga and McGilchrist talk about, the left hemisphere interpreter. And in fact, I'm pretty sure that this is talked about in the chapter that you have due for Thursday. And the study that I'm going to supplement in this lecture about the interpreter is the one that McGilchrist describes in the book as well. That I went to the original source, which is the Scientific American magazine, and I'm including some of the information from that specific magazine, but that's what McGilchrist was citing when he was talking about the interpreter. In the textbook, Gazanniga actually presents his own perspectives on the interpreter without referencing the Scientific American magazine article that I'm going to present and that McGilchrist cited. But we have already seen some stuff regarding the interpreter when we watched that video last time. And in a second, I'm going to ask you to kind of think back to what we saw in that video. And I'll show you some pictures, which will jog your memory, some screenshots from that video that have to do with this idea of the interpreter mechanism. So the interpreter mechanism is based on the idea that the left hemisphere of the brain is the one which is dominant for speech, for producing speech, that is saying things. And it's also dominant then for manufacturing explanations, even when the left hemisphere of the brain, which can do the explaining, even when it doesn't actually know the answer, or it doesn't actually know the true explanation for something. According to this idea of the interpreter mechanism, the left hemisphere is good at kind of coming up with creative, kind of like BS, I guess. It's good at coming up with an explanation for something and kind of doing so confidently, even if it doesn't actually know the correct answer. And so I want to go through, I guess it'll be 2 examples. Your textbook has an example, which I go through real quick. But then there's the example from the video that we watched the other day, which I'm actually going to criticize a little bit because there's something sketchy about it. And then I'll give you what I think is the best, most clear example, the Scientific American, the example from the Scientific American magazine I was just talking about. This is also what McGilchrist talks about in the book. This is the best example of the interpreter. So first, here is a screenshot of the video that we watched the other day, and you can actually see the exact time point in the video where this is occurring, around 5 minutes and 43 seconds. They're showing the participant who's looking at this image on a computer screen, and the word bell is going to this individual's right hemisphere, and the word music is going to this individual's left hemisphere. And the individual here presumably has the corpus callosum severed, and so that the information from each hemisphere can't transfer to the other hemisphere. So either each hemisphere is somewhat isolated from the other. Once again, bell is going to the right hemisphere, which is controlled by the left hand, and music is going to the left hemisphere, which is controlled by the right hand. Then, so this is just showing kind of the same thing I was just describing again. But then the participant is asked, and I'll move my picture here. The participant is asked to point to one of 4 pictures on a computer screen that best matches what he saw previously on the computer screen. So once again, bell was presented to the left visual field, which went to the right hemisphere. Music was presented in the right visual field, which went to the left hemisphere of the brain. And so here's the weird part, is that right here, this patient, he's pointing to the word bell. And you could, if you go back to the video, you see they talk about it and they say he pointed to the word bell, even though that's weird, because what the left hemisphere, which is controlled by this hand, this is the right hand, this hemisphere saw music. And so right here, this actually shouldn't have happened. My belief about this is that they wanted to get a take so that this could be on the television show. And that there was, like, they came in for shooting on day 1 and they didn't get a take of this. They didn't get a shot of this particular demonstration. And so they had to do like a reshoot where the people with the cameras came back in, and then they just wanted to get a shot of the patient doing this one thing, and they didn't think through everything. So I think this was staged. This particular example right here, I think, is staged because he should not have been pointing with his right hand to bell. He should have been pointing with his right hand to music. I see a chat. I'm curious to know if someone is agreeing with me. Someone says they're not getting audio. You guys are getting audio out there?
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah. Yeah. Everyone else is getting audio apparently. If you're not getting audio right now, I'm sorry, but I'll definitely post it on YouTube, and you should be able to get the audio then. I do apologize. Okay, continuing on. So this is sketchy, and to prove that this is so, this is the example of the interpreter, which is presented in the video that we saw the other day, and I think this was acted, and to kind of prove that, I'm gonna kind of read this to you because, well, this is a quote from the Gazanniga, taken from this Scientific American article. And I'll just, yeah, each hemisphere was presented a picture that related to one of 4 pictures placed in front of the split brain subject. The left and the right hemisphere easily picked the correct card. The left hand pointed to the right hemisphere's choice, and the right hand pointed to the left hemisphere's choice. That's not what happened in the picture that I just showed you. That was the right hand was pointing to the left hemisphere, was pointing to the right hemisphere's choice. I'm gonna go back. The right hand pointed to Bell, but Bell was in the right hemisphere, so it should have been the left hand pointing to Bell. This doesn't make sense. So this is a bad example of the interpreter. Well, everything about this example is okay, except for the fact that he's pointing to Bell with his right hand. He shouldn't have been able to have done that. He should have been pointing with his left hand. So I'm just pointing that out. This example, which is described here, and this is the best example right here. This whole thing is the best example of the interpreter. This is the same one that is described in Master and His Emissary. The Master and His Emissary doesn't have these pictures though, so this is even slightly better than Master's Emissary because it has these nice pictures and it has a nice description here. So we'll really go through this one closely, and then we'll evaluate how this is an example of the interpreter. So this is the participant fixates on this green fixation dot right in the middle of the screen. This scene of snow goes to this individual's right hemisphere, and this image of a chicken claw or chicken leg is going to this individual's left hemisphere. That appears on the computer screen for just briefly, so like 500 milliseconds, then it disappears. And then, so you imagine that this stuff is now gone. He saw it briefly, and then the image on the computer screen right here disappears. Then the participant has to choose with each hand what he had just saw. And says it, the right hemisphere. So the reason why the right hand, so someone tell me, why is this, the right hand is picking chicken? Can anyone kind of explain to me why this is the correct answer? Why does it make sense here that the right hand is picking chicken? Can anyone explain that to me?
Because the chicken foot, I guess, went to the left hemisphere, so it was in the right visual field, which went to the left hemisphere, and then the right hand is also controlled by the left hemisphere, so it's
Yes.
gonna point to.
Perfect. Yeah. So the right visual field had the chicken leg. That information about the chicken leg went to the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, the right hand. Therefore, this answer right here, the right hand picking chicken, that makes perfect sense because the left hemisphere, which saw the chicken leg, controls the right side of the body. So this answer just makes really good sense. And then the left hand right here, this picks shovel. So, but keep in mind that the left hand is controlled by the right hemisphere, and the right hemisphere is the one that has not very good speech production ability. The right hemisphere is not the dominant hemisphere for speaking. It is not the dominant hemisphere for explaining why something happened. But this picking shovel with the left hand, that is the right hemisphere, that is the correct answer. Can someone explain to me why is picking shovel the correct answer?
In the picture that's presented to the left eye, it's of a snow scene, and so someone would rationally choose a shovel to.
Yeah, Yeah, to pick up you know, when there's a snowy scene, you use the shovel to clean up the snow. The snow, and to be very clear, the snow scene was presented in the left visual field. It's actually not presented only to the left eye, it's presented to the left visual field. So the left side of both eyes are picking up the information of the snow scene. That's going to the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere controls the left hand, and therefore the left hand picks shovel because of the snow scene. But remember, this right hemisphere is not good at explaining things. It doesn't actually know why. It has a hard time because it's the not dominant speaking hemisphere. It has a hard time explaining why it actually picked shovel. The true answer is yes. It was because of the snow scene, and you use the shovel to pick up the snow. The right hemisphere saw the snow scene, therefore the left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere, picked the shovel to help clean up the snow. But if you look closely here, when asked, he was then asked, the participant was asked by the researcher, okay, why did your left hand pick shovel? Remember, the right hemisphere is not good at explaining things. The left hemisphere, on the other hand, is. But because of the corpus callosum being severed, the left hemisphere didn't know anything at all about the snow scene, because remember, the left hemisphere saw the chicken leg only. The right hemisphere, which can't talk, it saw the snow scene, and it used the left hand to pick shovel correctly. But then when you ask a person with the corpus callosum severed, why did you do something? Their right hemisphere isn't able to explain why they did something. So the left hemisphere has to try and come up with an answer. All the left hemisphere knows about is this chicken leg. And so the answer that the guy kind of puts this basically BS, it said, the right hemisphere chose the shovel to clean out the chicken shed. Remember, that's because the part of the brain which is doing the explaining is the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere saw the chicken. You then ask the person, why did this hand pick shovel? And the part of the brain which is doing the explaining, trying to explain why it picked shovel, all it knows about is that it saw a chicken leg. And so it has to try and come up with a story to explain why you would use a shovel to do something related to a chicken, when in reality, the reason it was picking shovel had to do with the snow scene. But once again, the speaking hemisphere didn't know anything about the snow scene, so it had to come up, it had to concoct, confabulate a story based on what it knew about, which is the chicken leg. So this is the same exact example which is talked about in Master and his Emissary. There's a similar example in the textbook, but I think this one's the easiest one to understand. And once again, please note that the thing that he's pointing with his left hand here, the thing that he makes the confabulation about is what his left hand is doing. In the video that I showed you earlier, he's pointing with his right hand, which is just not right. So this is not the good example. This is staged. This is acting. This was what do they call it? The reshoot. After they didn't get what they didn't want. It didn't look. They didn't have the right shoot, so they had to reshoot it with and he was acting, and it didn't work. Okay, so a couple more things. This is like I guess you could say a little theme. We talked previously in a different chapter, I think it was chapter 1, about some early research in cognitive neuroscience from Jackson based on lesion patients that showed that the right hemisphere of the brain was more important for spatial processing, the left hemisphere of the brain. There's a whole bunch of evidence that supports this idea, tons and tons of evidence that the right hemisphere of the brain is more important for spatial processing than the left. That's not saying the left doesn't do any spatial processing. That's just saying that the right hemisphere is more important than the left. And here's further evidence for this. Patient with the corpus callosum severed, they were asked to do the spatial diagram right here with either their right hand or their left. And when the person was asked to do it with their right hand, which is controlled by the left hemisphere, they weren't able to do this correct spatial, they got it wrong. But when asked to do the same task with the left hand, the participant was able to do it, presumably because the left hand is connected to the right hemisphere of the brain, and the right hemisphere of the brain is better at spatial processing. A person with their corpus callosum intact would be equally good with either hemisphere, whether you're using your left hand or right hand, because even if you're performing it with even if you're performing it with your right hand, that information from the right hemisphere can cross over to the left hemisphere of the brain, where it's then sent to your right hand. But you can only do that with the corpus callosum. And so this is further evidence that the right hemisphere is important for spatial processing. Okay, so here is another topic, yet again, that both, let's check out these chats real quick. Okay, looks like still dealing with that audio issue. So here's another topic which is talked about, I think, for the reading assignment for, so it's really good timing, a reading assignment for Thursday related to the Master and His Emissary. They talk about theory of mind, which is also talked in the textbook on this chapter as well. So there's a really good video. I'm actually not going to take the time to show it today in class. It kind of illustrates this idea of theory of mind in children. Because the idea is that this skill emerges usually around 3.5 to 4 years old. Mental skills are the ability to kind of put yourself in someone else's position so you can understand what's going on in that other person's mind. That's what theory of mind is. I mean, the idea is that when you're really, really young, like 2 or 3 years old, you are unable to put yourself in someone else's position. So you kind of naturally infer, or you naturally believe that everyone else in the world believes the exact same thing that you do. When in reality, of course, everyone else has different perspectives, and so they can have different beliefs about the world. When you're really, really young, according to this idea of theory of mind, you're not able to conceive of the idea that people's thoughts are different than yours. You think of everyone like, I have thoughts, therefore everyone else's thoughts have to be the same as mine. Everyone else's beliefs or perspective on the world has to be the same as mine. It's not until about 3 or 4 years old, 3.5 to 4 years old, according to developmental research, where people start to be able to realize, oh, that person, they might have seen things different than me. They might have different information or beliefs than I do. This idea of theory of mind is central to autism. It's a theory that explains kind of the difference mentally in individuals that have autism. And the basic idea is that individuals with autism do not develop theory of mind fully. So they have difficulty putting themselves in other individuals' shoes and being able to understand other people's mind. That's one of a very primary theory behaviorally of what autism is, the inability to apply theory of mind. And once again, this is a 3-minute video. It's a good video. I suggest watching it. But regarding the brain, here's another kind of point of convergence as far as the brain. Both Gazanniga and McGilchrist talk about the idea that to some extent, theory of mind relies more on the right hemisphere than the left. So this isn't true across the board. There are some regions of the theory of mind involves many regions of the brain. And a lot of those regions are actually equally bilateral. But if you look at the overall pattern of activation in the brain when a person is performing some type of theory of mind task, there is at least one region of the brain which is talked about here. This looks to be temporoparietal area. So it's the temporal lobe is right here. The parietal lobe is up here. So this is kind of on the boundary between the parietal and the temporal lobe. So this is usually referred to the temporal parietal area right here. So in this particular imaging study, they made the argument is that the right hemisphere temporal parietal area becomes more strongly activated than the corresponding area in the left hemisphere. So this is evidence of some hemispheric dominance for the right hemisphere in favor of for this theory of mind task. And McGilchrist, so it says right here from the textbook, theory of mind task activate a network of regions bilaterally. However, there is some regions in that network which are activated more in the right hemisphere than they are in the left. So it's a bilateral thing, but there's some evidence that some of those regions in the right hemisphere are working harder than the corresponding regions in the left hemisphere. So that's some evidence of right hemisphere lateralization, or probably a more true word would be right hemisphere dominance. And McGilchrist somewhat agrees with this, that right hemisphere is more important than the left for theory of mind. Finally, this is a new addition to the fifth edition of the textbook. Previously, the 4th edition did not have too much information about this Wada procedure, but it's actually been around for a while. This procedure, the Wada procedure, it's some of the most convincing evidence regarding hemispheric asymmetry come from the Wada procedure, because it's another way of temporarily damaging the brain, though or making it, maybe a nicer way of saying it, temporarily making the brain fall asleep. But what's really nice about it is that you can make exactly 1/2 of the brain fall asleep. So I don't completely understand the exact dynamics of this or exactly how the arteries work in this part of in the brain, but the basic idea is that there's two primary arteries, one that goes to the left hemisphere and one that goes to the right hemisphere of the brain. And this Wada procedure can basically can disrupt activity to exactly one half of the brain. You can make an injection of this of the chemical, which I'm was shown here. Amobarbital, a chemical, sounds like a barbiturate, and you could administer that into one of these two arteries. And if you admit it to one side, then the left hemisphere of the brain can be temporarily shut down. And you can see, for instance, if an individual's left hemisphere of the brain is shut down, then they're going to have problems with speech production. They'll probably have some problems with speech understanding as well. And you give this amobarbital when a person is awake, so you can have them perform behavioral tasks. You put their left hemisphere to sleep, you'll probably see some speech impairments. But if you put their right hemisphere to sleep, you'll see different set of impairments, probably related to spatial processing and so on. I'm not going to read this to you, but this explanation down here is a good one. And it explains an example of research that has been done with the Wada procedure. What I'm going to say is that Wada procedure is a good way of studying, of temporarily lesioning, temporarily impairing the performance of one half of the brain, and then looking at how behavior changes as a result. And a lot of the other study methods, like stroke, studying people that have strokes, or fMRI studies or EEG studies, a lot of those studies on hemispheric asymmetry correspond with the evidence from Wada procedure, which has given researchers a lot of information about differences between the left and right hemispheres. So now I think, I'm done lecturing. So then the last thing is an in-class discussion activity. You can work on this. I think I'm going to make it due tomorrow night because I don't think this is going to take too long. I think if you really wanted to, you could finish it quite easily before class is even done today. So yeah, I'll make it due tomorrow night. And you can work on it by yourself if you want, turn it in by yourself. Just on a Microsoft Word document, you'll answer these questions. And then I've already posted the turn in on Blackboard. I think I have posted the turn in on Blackboard, but there'll be a turn in class discussion activity for today's date, Microsoft Word document with the answer to these questions. And if you want, I can, if you want to work by yourself, you can go ahead and leave. These slides are posted so you can see the questions there. If you want me to randomly assign you to breakout rooms to work with other individuals, I can do that as well. So if I'm going to assume that anyone who wants to stay behind wants me to assign them to a breakout room. Let's see what these chats are about.
Someone asked in the chat this, but is the discussion activity separate from the quiz?
This is the quiz. Yeah. So
Okay.
I use those terms, and no, they're the same thing. This is the quiz I was talking about. So I can stop recording now.